Hey everybody, I just finished reading this book, The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam, and it's by Peter Oborne, former chief political correspondent at The Telegraph, long-time journalist, been a journalist for decades. I actually found it on somebody's table when I asked if I could borrow it, and I actually don't know where to start with this book. It took him 20 years to research and write, and you can tell the research has been done thoroughly. So first of all, it's an incredibly well researched, very well written book, tons of information in it, and to try and actually pick the most important parts of this, which is an amazing book. I think this should be required reading for anybody who wonders what's going on in the world and why it's going on in the world. Absolutely amazing. I'm going to start by reading you the back. They were the enemy within, to be monitored and harassed. I found that they were being treated. Oh, let me try again. I found that the way they were being treated was contrary to the British tradition of fairness and decency. They were a collection of mainly British citizens who were not welcome in British society, even though they had done nothing illegal. Why weren't they welcome? Who had they offended? What laws had they broken? Who indeed made the unacknowledged, unspoken rules that turned them into pariahs? This book is in part the story of my attempt to answer this question. Obviously, he's talking about British Muslims, but not just British Muslims, but Muslims all over the world. So what the book does is it's a history lesson. It's a lesson in religions. It's a lesson in wars. It's a lesson in how journalism works. How journalism works is important because the book is about what shaped world views, and a large part of that is journalism. So there's a chapter towards the end of the book which is Huntington's Bloody Borders. That's named after Samuel Huntington, who wrote something called The Clash of Civilizations. Hugely influential paper. It's about 30 years old now, and it talks about how at the end of the Cold War, wars will be between civilizations, and a major section is dedicated towards how Islam is a mortal enemy of the West, and it always will be, and there's no way it can happen because Huntington doesn't really understand Islam at all, obviously. But that doesn't matter because a lot of ignorance underlies decisions that affect the whole world. So, but talking about journalism, um, listen to this. So this is Oborne reflecting on his time as a journalist, and he spent a lot of time working with people like Boris Johnson. So let me read you this. Where should we start? If you played by the rules, advancement was easy. Editorships and knighthoods lay in wait for the ambitious, whilst the less successful could move sideways into profitable jobs in commercial lobbying or public relations, or obtain less well-paid but more exciting jobs in government communications. This environment also proved the perfect background for a move into politics. Both Boris Johnson, Prime Minister at the time of writing, and his cabinet colleague Michael Goves spent the first half of their careers in British journalism. Party affiliation didn't matter. Labour, with the telling exception of the years when Jeremy Corbyn was leader from 2015 until 2020, and the Tories are equally part of this game. Floating above it all are the media barons whose primary concern is not the dissemination of impartial and illuminating information. They are businessmen driven by the understandable need to sell newspapers. One of the easiest ways of achieving this is by running inflammatory campaigns against minority groups. There is a financial motive behind the countless fabricated stories about Muslims both abroad and in the UK. The endlessly repeated idea that Islam poses a moral threat to the West serves a commercial purpose. It's not just the newspapers. This book goes all the way back to the founding of the United States of America, and how initially they didn't have a navy, so pirates attacked their boats in the Mediterranean, affecting trade, which is why they lobbied for a navy and eventually got one from the UK. Those pirates happened to be from Muslim states, so they were called the Barbary Wars. Very rarely mentioned, apparently, in American history. So, there were there were stories from people who'd never actually met Muslims about how terrible and evil and monstrous and demonic they were, and of course it was seen as something which was counter Christianity, and the settlers in America were Christians. All right. And then it talks about how it talks about a lot of things. It talks about how Christianity morphed into evangelical Christianity, which sees Catholics as barely human anyway, never mind any other Christians, they're all less than human. And evangelicalism wants the rapture, which is the belief that Jesus will come back, the Messiah will return, and all his true followers will be sucked up to the sky to live in perfect eternal harmony and peace and everything else with him, and everyone else will die. There's even been industry started on this. So, and in order for that to happen, all the Jews first need to be in one place. So a lot of evangelicals actually say, yeah, Hitler was great because it was part of God's plan. He made all the Jews flee Europe and head to the Middle East. So the evangelical movement is a powerful voting bloc in the US, which is partly why you get a lot of American presidents just giving free pass to Israel to do whatever it wants, kill whoever it wants, take whatever it wants with no impunity, and why it's so dangerous to criticize Israel, because people in power may be playing to the evangelical vote. Well, some people actually believe it, of course, but that's covered, and that has to come up in how the West views Muslims, because part of the whole Zionist movement, and in the form it takes generally today, is to wipe out Palestinians, wipe out Arabs, because they're not, well, Zionists or Jews or what have you. But I mean, the book is utterly fascinating and moving and illuminating and upsetting. It talks about Freemasonry in Islam. It talks about, I mean, there are lots of prime ministers. The American view of Muslims in Islam is the most ignorant, as in the least knowledge, the least contact with Muslims historically and even in the current day. Of all the views covered are the British, the French, and the Americans. The French relationship is probably the bloodiest. So if you look at where the Arab Spring began, which has led to the destabilization of hundreds of thousands of deaths in the Middle East, partly down to people prescribing to Huntington's thesis about clash of civilizations, partly down to basically warmongers like Tony Blair, George Bush. I mean, how many millions of people are going to die based on that? And it covers Guantanamo. Let's not forget Guantanamo, the illegal prison. And it also covers the Judeo-Christian values. Now, before it does that, it does point out that many Christian leaders around the world were rabidly anti-Semitic. And then after World War II, they wanted the elimination of the Jews. But after the Second World War, they figured, this whole anti-Semitism is probably a bad look. So I know Christian Judeo-Christian values. That's going to be our new label. Lots of papers written on that, lots of stories made up about that and everything. And yes, there had been Christian-led genocide against the Jews. Loads of it. I mean, if you think that when genocide happens, of course, if it happened, we'd know. Well, the best documented genocide since the Second World War is the genocide of Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica. But if you go there now, if you go to Bosnia, they don't teach about it in schools. It never happened. No such thing. No. What Muslims? What massacre? What? The same as this belief that you get in a lot of places where there are massacres going on. For example, he covers in here the burning alive, rape, torture, disfiguring of Muslims in Myanmar carried out by Buddhists with state help. So I'm making it sound like a bloodier book than it is, but it really is just fascinating, really fascinating. And I mean, if I could read you there's so much in it, but if I could read you something from the conclusion, and then I will maybe just go through some sections with you, it's not all about world politics and its newspapers. It's got some personal examples of how this has affected people as well. So I might just go over one of those or two of those with you. And then there was a section in the conclusion which I thought was particularly illuminating. So I want to read that to you, which is, I just finished reading this now, so here's about the 100 pages of notes, bibliography, etc. Further reading. There's a lot of it. There we go. We urgently need to recognize the concept of terrorism has been debased. Originally applied to describe state terror in modern times, this usage was abandoned and applied exclusively to violence by non-state actors. In recent years, it has mutated once more and is now commonly applied to peaceful opposition movements. By an unnerving paradox, governments which themselves use domestic terror mercilessly against their own populations deploy the term to criminalize non-violent opposition. Muslim groups are the most numerous, though far from the only victims. The term is now worse than useless. It has become actively misleading and needs to be rethought. Talks about Al-Qaeda, of course. And Al-Qaeda and Western governments share the same view of Islam. But none of the, this whole clash of civilization thing, none of the 50 Muslim countries in the world have ever declared war on America. But America and its allies have declared war on terror, and terror just always happens to be Muslim countries, just conveniently. They're not human. You can just kill them. And then if we go back to the UK, because we're in the UK, it talks about this whole bullshit that the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and everyone loves to pump out about Muslim grooming gangs, and how that was all pretty much a hoax, using one very small case amongst the thousands of rape and grooming cases, and pumping it out onto the media like there was no tomorrow. And then even politicians got involved. Talking about politicians, interestingly here, there was David Cameron, who actually wrote in The Guardian about how many Brits should spend times with Muslims because they're the best example of the British values of decency, tolerance, conservatism and hard work that he's ever met. But then Michael Gove got a hold of him, along with the Kilam Foundation, founded by two ex-Muslim extremists. They got hold of him, and then after that it was all, Muslims are all terrorists. Yeah. And of course they kicked out Saeed Awasi. He was, well, not kicked her out. Was she kicked out? It was another lady who was kicked out. There's so much in this book. It really is fascinating, sobering, depressing, but it will open your eyes as to all the bullshit that we get fed. Thoroughly recommend it. Not an easy book to read. 380 pages. It's like reading about each section is like some kind of dissertation. Very, very well researched, like I said. So it starts off with the United States and Islam, the American relationship with Islam. The United States acquires Muslim subjects, of course, slavery and everything else. African Americans rediscover Islam. Islam and the United States as a global superpower, apocalypse imminent, God's plan for Israel, talking about evangelism, the impact of 9/11, how that seemed to legitimize the whole idea that there was a midnight vigils held in Tehran, Iran, that evil place, because of 9/11. Yeah, they saw it as most Muslim countries did, including the Taliban condemned the attacks. Yeah, you'll never hear that in the media, will you? It doesn't fit with the narrative. The assault on Islam, Britain and Islam, from Bede to Elizabeth I. So there were prime ministers and Elizabeth I as well, and people who said Britain is the most powerful Mohammedan, they called it back then, Mohammedan power in the world, because most of the subjects in the colonies were Muslims, and they did a great deal for England. In the wars, they were the front line, because you can kill them off even back then, even though we value them. They're not white, so let them die first, and then the white soldiers can come in and do the less bloody work. France and Islam, the enemy was amazing book, really amazing book. I could practically just sit here and read the whole thing to you, but I don't want to do a 100-hour book review. Oborne has written some other books as well. Anything by him I'll read now. He's become to me a bit like Tim Harford, someone who's worth reading. Tim Harford is the author of The Undercover Economist and How to Make the World Add Up. So I'm going to read you the inside sleeve and then end this review. As the Cold War fades into history of the last century, it appears to have been replaced by a new conflict between Islam and the West. Also, we were told. After the events of 9/11 and the advent of the war on terror, this narrative seems to be borne out. But as Peter Oborne reveals in this masterful new analysis, the concept of an existential clash between the two is a dangerous and destructive fantasy. All right, I'm not going to read the whole thing. Oh, it also talks about this Trojan horse thing, where a kid from, I think it was Bradford, read about how his school that he'd gone to as a child was, hardly anybody got 5 GCSEs or anything. So he decided to go in become a governor, learn everything he could about governorship, eventually took over the school and turned it into one of the best performing schools, despite 87% of people there not having English as a language when they started. It massively outperformed all the other schools. The Department for Education said it was an amazing school. Ofsted, for the first time ever, actually wrote that this is exactly what a school should be. And then somebody anonymous wrote this letter, a forged letter, and it was later revealed to be forged. But by then, the careers of the people and the teachers who'd worked at the school had been utterly destroyed. The Trojan horse letter: Muslims trying to take over the schools and instill Sharia law. Such fucking bullshit that ruined careers, ruined the future prospect of hundreds of children. But it goes with the narrative. So, really good book. I'm going to stop. Okay, hope you enjoyed the review. Have a good day.